Hey everyone, welcome to 30 where we dive into 30 life-changing books in 30 days, each summary packed into about 30 minutes. Our goal? To get you the insights you need to level up fast. Today, we're jumping into a fascinating read that explores the science of addiction and self-control. It's called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, by Dr. Anna Lembke, a psychiatrist and expert on addiction. This book is all about understanding how dopamine, the feel-good chemical that drives motivation and reward, affects our behavior, often leading to addictive habits. So, let's explore what's really going on in our brains and learn how we can find balance in a world full of temptations. Dopamine Nation starts with a powerful premise. Our modern world is designed to trigger our pleasure centers constantly. Dr. Anna Lembke, as both a psychiatrist and a professor of addiction medicine at Stanford University, dives deep into how dopamine, our brain's pleasure chemical, shapes not only how we act, but also why we often feel dissatisfied despite having so much. She argues that it's not that we don't have enough happiness, but rather that we're overloaded with opportunities to feel pleasure, leaving us more addicted and less happy than ever. Lembke explains dopamine's role in our brain as a pleasure-pain balance. When we do something that feels good, whether it's eating sweets, scrolling on social media, or even binge-watching a show, our dopamine levels spike. But as quickly as dopamine rises, it also drops, and the brain compensates by producing less of it, leading us to feel lower than we did before. This drop often leads to an urge to repeat the behavior to get back to that high point. It's a cycle that can lead to addictive habits over time, and this cycle, she says, is far more common in today's world of instant gratification. The pleasure-pain balance. Let's unpack the pleasure-pain balance concept with an example to clarify what Dr. Lembke means. The pleasure-pain balance works like a seesaw in our brain. When we experience pleasure, say by eating a sugary dessert, our dopamine levels spike, tipping the balance toward pleasure. But because our brain wants to stay in equilibrium, it pushes back, which can make us feel a bit low or flat once that sugar high fades. This dip is the brain's way of trying to restore balance by reducing dopamine. The more often we push this balance toward pleasure, especially with quick, high dopamine activities, the more pronounced that low becomes, resulting in what Lembke calls a dopamine deficit. Imagine the case of social media. You check your phone, and it's exciting to see new likes, comments, or messages. That hit of dopamine feels rewarding and even addictive. But over time, this constant stimulation leaves you feeling empty or anxious when you're not checking your phone. That's the dopamine pendulum swinging back, leaving you with an urge to reach for your phone just to feel normal again. To reset, Lembke suggests a practice called dopamine fasting, where you cut down or even take breaks from behaviors that give you these constant dopamine hits. The idea is to allow your brain to return to a natural baseline, reducing the need for these high-reward activities. So if you're used to checking your phone every few minutes, a dopamine fast might involve setting specific times to check it, maybe only in the morning, at lunch, and in the evening. Or if you're used to treating yourself with dessert after every meal, you might limit it to once a week. This fasting process helps your brain recalibrate, making those dopamine hits feel more satisfying when they do come, without the crash afterward. Ultimately, Dr. Lembke argues that by experiencing this temporary discomfort, we can reduce our dependence on constant dopamine hits, allowing us to enjoy pleasures more fully and avoid the crash that often follows. The result is a steadier state of happiness and resilience, even in a world filled with temptations. Real-life stories and practical advice. In Dopamine Nation, Dr. Lembke shares real stories from her patients, illustrating how dopamine-driven habits can take hold of our lives. These personal accounts make the science accessible and relatable, showing that we all face some form of addiction in a world of endless temptation. One memorable story is about a man who found himself increasingly addicted to video games. What began as a way to relax escalated to hours of daily gaming, costing him relationships and productivity. Recognizing the need for change, he worked with Dr. Lembke to take time away from gaming, imposing strict limits on himself. Over time, this dopamine fast helped him reset his pleasure-pain balance, and he gradually regained control, feeling less enslaved by the urge to play. By setting firm boundaries and being honest about his addiction, he was able to experience a deeper sense of satisfaction outside of gaming. Another patient struggled with social media addiction. She would wake up and spend hours scrolling through apps, comparing herself to others and feeling increasingly dissatisfied. Dr. Lembke encouraged her to practice self-binding, which meant setting physical and digital limits, like leaving her phone in another room overnight and only allowing herself specific times of the day to check social media, like leaving her phone in another room overnight and only allowing herself specific times of the day to check social media. This helped reduce the automatic impulse to check her phone constantly and allowed her to spend more time on activities that brought real fulfillment, like spending time with family or picking up a new hobby. Alongside these stories, Lembke recommends practical strategies for managing dopamine overload. One is radical honesty. She believes openly discussing our struggles and addictions, whether with a therapist, friend, or support group, helps break the shame and secrecy that can make behaviors addictive. This honesty helps disrupt the cycle of shame that keeps many addictions going. Another approach is embracing healthy discomfort. Rather than constantly seeking easy pleasure, she suggests intentionally choosing activities that might feel challenging initially, but lead to lasting satisfaction. Things like exercise, meditation, or spending time in nature may not provide instant gratification, but they help us build resilience and find meaning in life beyond quick dopamine hits. Dr. Lembke's practical advice reinforces the idea that by acknowledging and adjusting our behaviors, we can break free from dopamine-driven habits and lead a more balanced, fulfilled life. Self-binding, putting barriers in place. Self-binding is one of Dr. Lembke's central strategies for managing addictive behaviors. The idea is simple, yet powerful. Rather than relying on willpower alone to resist temptations, we can create intentional barriers that make it harder to fall into our habitual traps. Self-binding shifts the focus from inner discipline to smart external changes in our environment, which makes habits easier to control. Consider binge-watching TV. For many people, streaming platforms with endless episodes can quickly turn just one episode into hours of viewing. Self-binding for this habit might mean setting a timer on your TV or tablet that automatically shuts it off after a certain period. Some people go a step further by keeping their streaming devices in a different room or even unplugging them entirely when not in use. These barriers don't eliminate the possibility of binge watching, but make it inconvenient, which nudges you toward making different choices. Another common example is managing smartphone use, particularly with social media. Rather than relying on willpower to resist checking notifications, someone might use self-binding techniques like setting app time limits or enabling grayscale mode on their phone to make it visually less engaging. Some even lock their most addictive apps behind a password shared only with a trusted friend, making it much more difficult to give in to mindless scrolling. By creating physical or psychological distance from the behavior, self-binding helps reduce the habit's grip over time. Even in the realm of food, self-binding can be incredibly effective. Imagine someone who is trying to cut back on sugar, but finds themselves constantly tempted by sweets at home. A self-binding strategy could be keeping all sugary treats in a high cupboard or a separate pantry that's not within easy reach. Some people may even choose to avoid buying sweets altogether so that the act of indulging requires a trip to the store. These barriers help to disrupt automatic cravings, giving our mind space to make more intentional choices. Dr. Lembke emphasizes that self-binding is not about eliminating pleasure or access altogether. Instead, it's about setting up an environment that reduces the chance of automatically reaching for these pleasures. By adding friction to behaviors that often bring quick dopamine hits, we're better able to pause, reflect, and choose actions that align with our goals and long-term well-being. Self-binding ultimately helps us regain control in a world filled with constant temptations. Balance in a world of excess. In Dopamine Nation, Dr. Lembke concludes with a powerful message about finding balance. She reminds us that the goal isn't to eliminate pleasure or avoid enjoyment altogether, but to seek a steady equilibrium. In a world where almost anything we desire is just a click away, this balanced approach becomes crucial for genuine happiness and fulfillment. Lembke describes pain and pleasure as two sides of a scale in our brain. When we pursue too much pleasure, we experience an inevitable swing back toward pain as our brain tries to restore equilibrium. This is why chasing pleasure through constant dopamine hits, whether from social media, sugary foods, or binge watching, can leave us feeling depleted, anxious, or numb. On the other hand, by occasionally choosing discomfort or delaying gratification, we give ourselves the opportunity to reset, which allows us to enjoy pleasure in a more balanced, sustainable way. One example she uses is exercise. Physical exertion, especially at first, may not feel pleasurable. It's tiring and even uncomfortable. However, once we get into a regular exercise routine, our brain rewards us with dopamine in a much more balanced way. Rather than an extreme spike and crash, exercise provides a steady increase in dopamine that leaves us feeling good and mentally balanced long after the workout ends. It's an example of choosing healthy discomfort that ultimately enhances our well-being without creating dependence or negative after effects. Another way to think about this balance is with something as simple as food. While occasional indulgences can be pleasurable, Dr. Lembke cautions against allowing them to become regular habits that desensitize us to true satisfaction. By moderating our intake and sometimes choosing healthier, less immediately rewarding options, we actually enhance our ability to appreciate treats when we do have them. This approach keeps the pleasure scale steady and lets us avoid the roller coaster of intense highs and lows. Dr. Lembke encourages us to build a lifestyle that involves both comfort and challenge. Rather than living at one extreme or the other, we can adopt small daily practices that mix both pleasure and discipline. Practices like mindfulness, journaling, or even taking breaks from social media are examples of this balanced approach, creating moments of reflection and reset. By leaning into discomfort at times and resisting the pull of constant gratification, we not only regain control but also heighten our capacity for joy. Ultimately, Lembke's message is that a life well lived is one where pleasure and pain work in harmony. The steady, centered well-being we're aiming for may not be as exciting as the quick dopamine spikes from constant indulgence, but it's a far more rewarding and lasting state. In a world of excess, this balance is the key to reclaiming agency, creating resilience, and experiencing a deeper, more meaningful sense of happiness. Takeaways for living a balanced life. So, to wrap up, Dopamine Nation teaches us that to find true happiness, we need to resist constant indulgence and learn to be okay with discomfort now and then. By understanding how dopamine affects us, we can make choices that lead to lasting satisfaction rather than short-term highs. In a world where we're encouraged to chase every pleasure, Lembke's advice is a refreshing reminder to pause, take a breath, and think twice before giving in to that next impulse. Thanks for tuning in to 30-30-30. We hope today's dive into Dopamine Nation has given you some actionable insights to help you find balance. If you like this summary, hit subscribe and stay tuned for tomorrow's episode, where we'll be tackling another game changing book.